The title of this presentation is Nazorean or Nazarene Beliefs and Practices around 45 AD. That's about 10 years after the resurrection. What did they believe? What did they practice? It's my own personal observations and speculations, but from at least 30 years, casual readings of apostolic texts, biblical text, big biblical literature, apocryphal texts that I think that are worthwhile, etc. And the texts that I think are authoritative for learning a lot about the primitive believers, the Nazareans or the way, include the Revelation, very, very Hebraic, apocalyptic, James, Jude, Mark, some of Matthew, some of 2 Peter, certainly the Clementines, the Nazarene Acts, the later scrolls, that is the Dead Sea Scrolls, and some of the Apocryphae. What I don't consider to be too authentic is the nativity cycles of the New Testament. I don't consider most of Paul to be authoritative, though we need Paul for a lot of things in the scripture. He is primarily working to set up Gentile assemblies in a very ancient time, and a lot of the things that he has to say, he prefaces them that this is not a word of the master, but rather this is my opinion. Sometimes his opinions just don't fit in our modern world. So I'm not demeaning Paul. Rather, I am just mentioning that he's off on a different track than these apostolic Jew guys like Peter and James. Especially don't credit the Ephesians or Colossians. These are not where Jewish Christians were to a great extent. John's or Luke's Gospels, now I take Mark as the first authority. And I found out here lately that Luke was written specifically for the purpose of exonerating Paul before Nero in the court in Rome. That reason for having Luke write Luke and Acts is a very good one and really pans out with the people who speculate that and their proofs of that. And I don't have the book here right now, but there is a book that you could read and you will be convinced that that's the reason, as an apology to the Roman government for primarily Paul's actions in a greater extent, those that were called Christiani at that time. So the people I'm talking about now were called Nazarenes. In their time, they were called the Hebrews, the Way. Today, they're called Nazarene Israel, to a great extent. Nazarene, some declare themselves Nazarene branches, and Ebionites, the poor. There are some that are like that, that have titles like that, but are not related to our bunch, and that's the Nazarea, the Nazarean, Nazarenes, the Nassenes, Nazarenes. It's almost unlimited number of titles here for other movements that, did they plagiarize the word Nazarene? I don't know. There's still a sect in Iraq known as the Nazarenes or the Nazrani. I've done a couple of programs on them, but the Nazrani still follow John the Baptist as the Messiah. And we're not talking about any aspect of the Church of the Nazarene down in the corner on your little town next door. They were early Nazareans, who I'm going to talk about, and they were late Nazareans, 4th century, through the 11th century, where we can't really find them anymore, at least under that name. The early ones are the ones I'm talking about, not the later ones, because the late Nazarenes were not distinguished from the Roman Christians, the Orthodox Christians, with their the paganisms that they added, saying that the late Nazareans were in all respects Christians, except they kept the Torah, but they also kept the feast. The Torah. That's right. They kept the Torah and the feast still, even when the Roman Christians were calling them heretical and of the devil, simply because they kept the Torah as well as believing on Yahshua. Now, there are two sects. One is called the Essenes, and another one, Nazareans, spelled a little differently. They were the two main groups within the Essenes. So Essenes were made up of Essenes and Nazareans, actually Nazareans, but look at that closely. Were the Essenes two groups, and probably existed before the birth of Yahshua, and undoubtedly the Nazarenes we're talking about came out of the Essene movement. My friend wrote a book called Jesus Was a Qumran Essene. It's in the public domain. I have it here. I can't even remember what his name is, but that was probably one of the most authentic books that I've ever read that has proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Yahshua movement came out of the Essenes by comparing their beliefs and practices. And personally, I believe that some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the later ones, were actually New Testament type books, especially the Pesher of Habakkuk, the Pesher of Nahum, the Pesher of the Psalms. Those three, they follow the story of the Nazarenes perfectly, from what we know. Now, we learn a lot about the Nazarenes from their detractors. You notice I'm moving fast tonight because there's a lot I'd like to get in. So if you feel like you need to leave, don't worry about it, because I'm just going to go on as long as I can. A lot to learn from the Nazarenes, from their detractors. Let me give you one example, maybe two. The following I'm going to read is a creed from the church in Constantinople, the early Constantinople church. Remember, that is the one that Constantine set up in his new capital, Constantinople, which of course means the city of Constantine. And in this creed, it condemns the practices of the Nazarenes. And I just like to find these so much, because when they're condemning, they're also telling us what they did. And what they did and what they believed is rather obscure. You've got to really go looking for it, as I have. Here's the creed. People use this every week in their Sunday service. I renounce all customs, rites, legalisms, unleavened breads, sacrifices of lambs of the Hebrews, and all other feasts of the Hebrews, sacrifices, prayers, aspersions, purifications, sanctifications, and propitiations and fasts, and new months, and Sabbaths, and superstition, and hymns and chants, and observances, and synagogues, and the food and drink of the Hebrews. In one word, I renounce everything Jewish, every law, rite, and custom, as if afterwards I shall wish to deny and return to Jewish superstition, or shall be found eating with the Jews, or feasting with them, or secretly conversing and condemning the Christian religion, instead of openly confuting them and condemning their vain faith, then let the trembling of Gehazi cleave to me, as well as the legal punishments to which I acknowledge myself liable. That was at that time to be burned at the stake. And may I be anathema, cursed in the world to come, and may my soul be set down with Satan and the devils. Now, is that not anti-Semitism? I guess so. We might find that in one of the mosques in Gaza City. Could well be. As far as the tremblings of Gehazi, we read about that in 2 Kings 4:13, if you didn't remember this, and I didn't. It says there, he may have thought she would express her wishes more freely to Gehazi than to himself. Thou hast been careful with all this care, whatever that means. But what she wished was literally called trembling. So when they're talking about cursing the Nazarenes or cursing themselves, with the trembling of Gehazi, they're talking about this particular passage, 2 Kings 4:13. I don't know the context. I didn't have time to go find that. And one more example of a creed or a writing here that cast dispersion upon the Nazarenes, even the Nazarenes of Yahshua's own making. Of course, I'm talking about Epiphanius from the Panarian, the medicine chest for heretics that he wrote and that can be read today. And he says, the Nazareans, they were Jews by nationality, originally from Gileaditis, Bashanitis, and the Transjordan, where that is, if you have a little knowledge of the geography of Israel, that's to the east. Those little places are to the east of the Sea of Galilee, or Kinneret. They're to the east. And remember that Nazareth, Cana, and the rest that were known for Nazarenes are on the west side of the Sea of Galilee. So both in Syria, out in the wilderness of Bashan, and also in Galilee, we have a lot of Nazarenes up there, and Epiphanius says that this is where they were from. And I'm sure he's right. They acknowledge Moses and believe that he had received laws, not this law, however, but some other law. And of course, what else could he be talking about there but the temple scroll? The temple scroll, which is undoubtedly to me the prototype of the Masoretic Torah, temple scroll. And so they were Jews who kept all the Jewish observances, but they wouldn't offer sacrifice or eat meat. They considered it unlawful to eat meat or make sacrifices with it. Now, remember, we're talking about Epiphanius writing 400 years after Yahshua. So there might have been considerable change in that time. Continuing, they claim that these books are fictitious. Now, books is in capitalized, so they may be talking about Bibles. We read again in the homilies and the recognitions that some parts they believed of the Pentateuch, the Tanakh, were false. If they denigrated Elohim and showed Elohim to be evil in any way, they claimed that other sects of Jews that had translated and carried those books on had falsified this knowledge for the purpose of explaining some type of event that they couldn't explain. They just made God do that and in their writings. And sometimes for some of the things, you almost got to believe that. They considered it unlawful to eat meat. I did that one. And that none of these customs were instituted by the fathers. Of course they weren't. He's talking about church fathers like himself, Gentiles, ex-pagans. This was the difference between the Nazareans and the other Jews. So he's saying in his time that the Nazarenes were not just regular Jews. And through my study and what I'm going to do tonight, as long as I have time, I think that you'll agree with me that their events, their feasts, their beliefs, their practices are indeed pretty far away from regulation Jews, Pharisees, and Sadducees. But I want to start with Yeshua and with his company to tell you what they believed. Some of this may be a little shocking to Christians that might be listening here, and it might make you think in your mind all of a sudden that, yeah, these guys were heretics. And maybe those of you that are Hebrew roots type of people and want to be Nazarene Israelites or working toward your self-perfection, you might consider what you believe and practice in comparison with the Nazarenes. All right, the first ones at about 45 AD, we have evidence that they did not believe in a virgin birth. Birth wasn't important, except they admired a peasant birth because the other would-be messiahs before were peasants. Though the later Nazarenes did cave in, as I mentioned before, on the virgin birth. How do you stand on the virgin birth? I'm afraid to tell you how I stand. However, I think I would surprise you. Why don't I tell you? I believe in the virgin birth. And you know why? Because I decided to. Not because it's logical, not because all these other evil kings and gods were all born of virgins that we read about. I just decided to. And sometimes with our belief system, we can do that. Jesus came, let me use that name, to reestablish the law as the new Moses. We're taught that right off in seminary. He's the new Moses, the new lawgiver. Jesus was the Son of Man, is the Son of Man. Son of Man means mediator, a mediator between Elohim and humankind, and a mediator between Elohim and angelic forces, such as the mediator Enoch, Eliah, Melchizedek or Melchizedek. These also are considered to be son of man's, plural, because they were mediators. And actually, there is a verse I'm going to, well, I'll quote it now since we're talking about it. It's in 1 Timothy. Here it is. 1 Timothy 2:4, one I learned at Baptist Summer Bible School. God, who wants everyone to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. For there is one God, there is one mediator between God and men. Speaking of the man, Christ Jesus, this is out of a Protestant Bible, who gave himself a ransom for all, the testimony that was given at just the right time or at the pregnant time, literally. Now, let me just repeat a little bit of this. Something just happened on my screen here. Sorry. Let me try to get it back again. It jumped down to 30%. What do you think about that? All right, I'm finding it. Mediator. Okay. Now you understand what I mean. Jesus, Yeshua, was sinless in regards to the Torah. Yes, our first ancestors believe that he was sinless, perfect without sin, and that Yeshua was the son of Elohim, but he didn't become the son of Elohim until he was baptized, that he was adopted the son of Elohim at his baptism. And some point out that when Yeshua was getting baptized, the real quote that was there from the sky, let me see if I can remember it. This is my son, the beloved. This day I have adopted you. Now, where does that come from? That's from the Psalms, as you probably know. But that psalm was interpreted for the book of the New Testament as in whom I'm well pleased, period. But not the rest of that verse, the rest of that psalm that says, it doesn't say who I'm well pleased. It says, this day I have adopted you. Take a look in the Psalms and see. And so they believe that exactly. I don't know why the gospel writer changed that psalm or who did, but somebody did. Yahshua came to do away with animal sacrifices entirely. That's what he says in the Gospel of the Nazarenes. That gospel, we only have parts of it, just fractions of it, with a few sayings. And just a couple sayings that come from Yahshua, but he lays it flat out, straight out there in the Gospel of the Nazarenes. So you can imagine when in the Gospel of the Nazarenes that they used exclusively, that when he talks about in the other quote that his father took him by the hair and lifted him to go someplace, that his father took him by the hair and transported him somewhere, that's kind of an embarrassment, isn't it? But in the apocryphal liturgy of the Old Testament, Habakkuk was also taken by the hair to the animal den of Nebuchadnezzar to feed Daniel in that lion's den. And it was thought that Habakkuk was bald because Elohim took him by the hair. And when Elohim, as it says, brought him back to feed the rest of the field workers there, he was a cook. That was the end of his hair. The power of Elohim burned it all off. So there is kind of a scriptural background for Yahshua being picked up by the hair and taken someplace. I can't remember where. Yahshua is unified with Elohim in unity, in purpose only, not in substance. Because evidently the Nazarenes were logical people, and the idea that Elohim, who was a spirit and who is in all places at once, how could he possibly be flesh too and died on a cross, on a stake, without the world falling apart. That's logical to me. And you're reading about the creeds of the Catholic Church. This is one thing, that he's the God-man, that he is the same as God, that there is a trinity of gods. Somehow they say there's a trinity, but it's still a unity. And that makes no sense at all. In fact, one Episcopal writer, present day, wrote a book on the Trinity that I had to read in the seminary. It was ridiculous. It started out with a big pot on a fire, and Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are around the pot, cooking up something. And they decide individually, and then they come into unity on what they're going to do about the creation. And they have a party, and by the end of the story, there is confetti coming down. There's a lot of tov, tov being heard all over heaven, and the pot's boiling with a man in it. And then the next chapter goes on to explain that in some way. I thought you start a book on the Trinity like this? Well, that story is about as ridiculous as the Trinity is. Yeshua didn't pre-exist, they believe. I believe that he did. I don't have to be like them in everything. You don't have to. I believe that he did pre-exist, and that the angel of Yahweh found in the Old Testament is him in one form or the other. But the early Nazarenes did not, because they saw a man before them. They saw a man before them that did everything that a man did, but without sin. He probably joked. He probably laughed. He probably had to go use his little shovel once in a while outside the camp. He was a man, and he was sinless in regards to the Torah. Unified, okay, unified. Though he didn't pre-exist, they believed that he was heaven sent. Well, he said as much in the gospel, something like, no one has ascended except the one who descended, speaking of himself. And they believed that Yeshua was a priestly lineage. And of course, two of courses. One is the only priestly lineage that he could possibly be from was a Zadokite priestly lineage. Now, the Zadokites were spoken of by Elohim in Ezekiel chapter 44, that they were to be the heads of the temple, the liturgy, and the word for eternity, because the other priestly families had let him down. So the Zadokites, the Zadokite priesthood, was taken away from Israel by the usurping Sadducees in about 165, in the midst of the Jewish Civil War. We call the Maccabean War. The Zadokites were cast out, and the Greeks, the Sadducees, were cast in. Many of the Zadokites were martyred, killed, and most of the rest of them left. You know, they went to Egypt or they went to Syria, out in the same place where all the Nazarenes were, in Bashan, Trachonitis, etc. And while we're on that subject, let me just mention that I believe that the Hasidians, not to be confused with the Hasidians or the Hasids of today, not the same, but the ones spoken of in 1st and 2nd Maccabees were indeed Essenes, were indeed the relatives of Zadok, relatives and priests of the Zadokites, and that Joshua was in their line. And if anything that Joshua was in line with, so was James, his brother. So was Simeon, the other brother. So was Yosei, the youngest brother. They were all in that line. And because they were, no wonder they were always under persecution. They always had people from Rome or people from Greece following them around. And more of those Zadokites were killed in the ensuing 200 years than had been even when they exiled them. So in that line, they also martyred James and Simeon, the brother, and Yeshua martyred, and half of the crew that Yeshua called disciples. Now, let's see. So Yeshua was believed not to be God, but united in purpose, not to be part of a Godhead, not the second person of the Trinity, not, as Anselm wrote, the God-man, not an angel, not an aeon, not a Gnostic archon, not at all, except a mediator, one God, one mediator between God and man, the man, Yeshua HaMashiach. Now, can you see that? 1 Timothy 2:9. Everything that points to the Trinity in the New Testament has been logged in there, like 1 John chapter 5. If you see something that looks like a Trinity in there, it's been seen to be written in an ancient manuscript in the margin, not in the text, but got picked up later on when they hand copied these manuscripts for sale. And that Yeshua could have been married. We have a little testimony of Paul about this, who says that his brothers were married and that Peter was married. So why couldn't Yeshua be married? I don't know if Yeshua's wife, if he had one, had their own gospel. Who knows? But he certainly could have been, especially as a priest, he could have been married. Now, I'm not going to speculate whether he was or not, but it seems like he would be if what we're told the little bit about Mary Magdalene, and also about her in the apocryphal literature, because the Apocrypha is full of Mary Magdalene as a teacher and a famous teacher. Though the New Testament, of course, was very anthropocentric and left that out, except to call her a devil-filled person who was delivered. He could have been married. One archaeological find suggests that he had a son. Yes, suggests that he had a son. It's a pretty strong suggestion, but I'm not going to go into that because that is so controversial. I lost an entire congregation about when the Jesus wife text came out. And then, of course, it was found to be false, but it called it the Gospel of Jesus' wife. I won't tell you what happened, but the guy brought it up, Jesus' wife and his son, in one of our tabernacle meetings. Now, about 10 years ago, I suppose, everybody got mad and quit right after a woman in the congregation got up and had a fit in the middle of the teaching. Wow. That was the end of it. Now, concerning the believers, now we talked a little bit about Yahshua. I'm looking at my time. I mentioned that the believers and Yahshua and his family himself was undoubtedly a descendant of the Hasidians. You can see that there's some Maccabees in the genealogies that we find in Matthew and in Luke. And we find what little we know about the doctrine of the Hasidians was very very much like the Nazarenes of later on. And I might add too, the Hasidians, I did mention this in First and Second Maccabees. You can read in there about the Maccabees and the Hasidians teaming up to fight the Greeks. But then the Maccabees turned against the Hasidians. They complained when the Maccabees started taking up for themselves the priestly offices. And finally, John Maccabee took the head of the army, the high priest, one more, temple treasurer, can't remember exactly, but the three main roles that had always been held by three people, including a high priest. He wasn't in the right family. He took them all. That cut off the Zadokites, who had been listed again in Ezekiel as to having authority over the temple forever and over the priesthood forever. Well, we believe that the Hasidians was also a dynastic movement. That is to say, they kept the family going over periods of time. And we also know that there were plenty of Zadokite priests around in the time of Yeshua, but they had no force in religion. In fact, we are told by Josephus that the Sadducees stole their tithes. Now, you probably heard this from me a few times, but that is outrageous. That is outrageous. People give to Elohim these tithes. The only thing tithes are to be used for is to pay your teachers, to pay your priests. That's all they're to be used for. And taking that money away from those poor priests, taking it away, it was to be split up among all the priests in Israel, including the Zadokite priests. And for their own sake, investing the priests' salaries in something very similar to a stock market in Greece. So they say these people could retire someday. Does that sound familiar? Like Social Security? Well, at least we get something of what we put away those years in Social Security. For some reason, they never got anything because they always died long before it would pay off. So it was dynastic. It was in the family, as was the assembly of Yahweh in Jerusalem under first James the Just, and then Simeon Bar Clopas, and then other relatives from that family kept the dynamicism going until well into the 2nd century. And as I mentioned before, these were not dynastic they were not regular Jews. They didn't believe or practice in any means how the Sadducees did or how the Pharisees did. We know a little about Pharisees. We know that if the text is true in Matthew 23, the Nazarenes didn't like them very much because Yahshua didn't like them. They were hypocrites. And of course, we know that the Sadducees were no better and probably worse because their God was the belly. Their God was mammon. How could people seeking perfection possibly be like either one of those? They couldn't. And they were so irregular as Nazarenes that they had nothing to do with the temple. They had nothing to do with sacrifices. And people say it's because they were vegetarians. That is not the reason at all. They would, if they had the priesthood, gone back to the sacrificial system because they believed in Torah. And I believe they would have gone right back to it if they had a chance. After all, they were priests. This is what they were trained to do, is go back there. It would have been great if they'd had a chance and they could have said, no, because the master says, I came to do away with sacrifices and not do them. And maybe that way it would fall. I just don't know. But I know that when you read about Yeshua at the temple, he's going to be on Solomon's porch, which is not in the temple, or he's going to be on the temple steps, or he's going to be in the court of the nations. None of those three places is in the temple. So you could go out, and James himself, as we have read, taught at the temple steps when he taught, and he had a great crowd around him when he did, but not inside the temple. They're not regular Jews, but they were Sabbath keepers, and that day that they kept was the seventh-day Sabbath. And I get questions all the time of people asking me, what day is really the Sabbath? Saturday. Is that so hard? And I'll tell you, a lot of people have tried to prove that the days haven't changed. But there's two ways you can. I think anyone can, at least getting back to historical times, is to do research into the word Shabbat. You'll find that all over the world, with the exception of here, has the name of the seventh day of the week that is based on Shabbat, based on the word seven. I already did this research, and that's a fact. Take a look and see. The second way is to consider the quails. If that's a true story, I keep saying, if that, I've been taught to be so skeptical. Besides, I'm a rather critical person anyway, but I came to acknowledge the fact that people criticize me for that, but this is the way Elohim made me, and I am on the road to perfection, no matter what people may think. I am. And if I am, I just have to use my critical spirit. I'm not talking about a demon or anything like that. I have to use my ability to criticize in a constructive way. But unfortunately, the devil takes us on that dark road, and we find ourselves going the dark road in our ability to criticize until it doesn't become constructive. It becomes destructive. Look at, I guess I'll do a little more on this. Look at Thomas. They call him Doubting Thomas. All right, so he's doubting. Unless he puts his finger in Yeshua's wound, he won't believe. Well, what did Yeshua say to him beforehand? He said that lots of messiahs would be coming around. Lots of people will come in my name. And the devil can appear in the form of a bright angel. So what's Thomas do? He remembers those words. And I believe that Yeshua at that time said, hey, here's one I can trust. And you know the history of Thomas in India, which is not a made-up story. There are still churches in Kerala, India, that Thomas started, not doubting. He probably did more than anyone except maybe Peter in spreading the word. Thomas is quite a person. I'd like to talk about him sometime. All right, Sabbath keepers, they were not celibate. They were not monastic. They weren't that type of Essene. But Paul says, who is not part of this group, Paul's a different type all his own, though he's called a Nazarene in Acts. He tells people the time is too short. Don't get married. Don't get involved in those affairs. Yeshua says, unless you hate your mother, How popular is that? You can't be my disciple. There's a reason for that. And that reason is Paul, Joshua, Peter, John, the writer of the little letters, they knew what was coming up, not only by prophetic utterance, but also just by living in a world like that. That hell was going to come down on Jerusalem. They had all the prophecies about the day of the Lord and the end times, and they knew that was going to happen. I can't stand it when I hear these lecturers say that, oh, Paul was wrong about his predictions, or Jesus was wrong about predictions, because look, it's 2,000 years later and none of this has happened. Some scholars I've heard say that. I turn them off. I mean, I won't listen to that, because that's absolutely, as my little granddaughter said 30 years ago, Santa, you're so ridiculous. That is ridiculous. All right, the Nazarenes were against the Maccabeans. They were against them because of slaughtering and exiling their ancestors. They had nothing to do with Hanukkah. Nothing to do with that. On the other hand, they were pro-Enochian. We know this because there are so many allusions to the Enochian literature, first Enoch, second Enoch, not third Enoch, first and second Enoch. In fact, one book that I would really like to study with everybody is Second Enoch, because what's in there is very clear about an afterlife and about the 7 or 10 heavens, etc. Good. But so the Nazarenes, they didn't like the Maccabees, wrong priesthood. They were pro-Enochian, and they followed Enoch to a great extent. And I believe and speculate that that covenant that I found in First Enoch, when I was translating that, the Enochian cosmic covenant, maybe you've heard about it. I've got several different presentations on that, about the restoration of all creation, and then the end coming, that actually the end of the world is never coming. World without end. And the cosmic creation was probably the first creed, the first covenant ever sealed by Elohim. Fortunately, Paul picks up the ancient Enochian covenant about the restoration of creation. Paul tells us really even more about it than Enoch does in oh, wow. Well, one of the places is 1 Corinthians 15, and the other place is Romans 8. There you go. Isn't my memory great? Romans 8. We're going to get the second lesson on the Enochian covenant, and in 1 Corinthians 15, you get the third lesson. That's what Paul is really good for, because Paul is a scholar, no doubt about that. You should read him in Greek. You'd think he was a scientist. Next, solar calendar, unlike the rest of Israel. That can be proved by comparing the 3 days in the grave, in the tomb, between the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. Remember, John is told to have a friend that's close to the priesthood. That's a Sadducean priesthood. And they would have been on the lunar calendar, the lunisolar calendar. It's the lunar calendar. And so John writes up his resurrection story from that perspective. But the three synoptics do not. Solar calendar there. That's why some people trying to do a Bible study on this get all messed up, because they can't be reconciled. They cannot, without putting some stuff in there that's not the case. Then James, of course, the just, was anointed. We have several sources that say the highest officer of the assembly of Yahweh in Jerusalem, the successor of Yahshua. And I want to make a note on one of the comments about James that you'll read if you do any study into him at all. And that is from Hegesippus. Hegesippus was a Nazarene who converted to Christianity. He was a first century Nazarene. He was born somewhere around 90 AD. So he was in a great time to write about the growth of Christianity and also the lives of the apostles. He wrote 5 books. Unfortunately, all but a few scraps have been destroyed. Hegesippus tells us, through somebody that had a copy of this 400 years later, that James didn't bathe or use oil. Literally, James didn't use the bath or use oil. I had a hard time with that. How can that be? Is what James' letter in the Bible, is it not true? Is it not true? I probably first read that at least 30 years ago. And again, that's in Hegesippus. Just put him in a search engine and his stuff will come up. Or get out your Ecclesiastical History by Eusebius. Note how I pronounce that. Eusebius. And you'll read it there, because Eusebius saved that for us so we know about it. Is it not true that we should use oil when we're healing people? Or that we should not take a bath? I think no oil and no bath. Boy, these guys must have stunk something fierce. I can imagine John the Baptist not taking a bath, but not James. He was a priest, a high priest. Was James filthy? Doesn't this conflict with his writings, his letter, when he says, call for the elders of the assembly? What Hegesippus means, if you ever get answered or asked this question, there's a great answer to this. And it finally dawned on me when I was reading a novel about ancient Rome. It's a novel about the times of Nero. In fact, the book, The Source, by James Michener, it's in there as well. That was a very popular book from the 60s, and a lot of people have that on their shelf. They don't even know it. But it takes the history of a Tel. Tel is a ruin in Israel. And Michener brings it through from its beginning through all history till today. It's fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. But it does also answer the question about why James didn't take a bath. I'm making a big deal out of this, aren't I? Well, anyway, here's why. What Hegesippus means is that he didn't use public baths. That makes a lot of difference. And he didn't use the oil, because in the public baths, men and women, bona fide truth, they bathed in the nude and they bathed together. There might be a line of separation, but they bathed naked at the same time. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of sexual contact in the bath. There's going to be a lot of homosexuality practiced right out, as in Turkish baths today. I understand that if you're not a homosexual, don't go in there because you'll be shocked out of your mind. So that's what he didn't do. And both Greece and Rome instilled those public baths all over in Israel, just as they had both in Athens and in Rome. Now, another thing they did in the nude was they striggled each other, or there were slaves in there, slave boys and girls who were also open to illicit sexual relations, that striggled them. What's a striggle? I learned about this in Michener's book. He had a Roman in there using a striggle, and I went, what is a striggle? They found that striggle, 2,000 years later in the archaeological site they were trying to uncover. But the striggle, from Wikipedia, is a tool for cleansing the body by scraping off dirt, perspiration, and the oil that was applied before bathing in ancient Greece and Roman cultures. The standard design is a curved blade with a handle, all of which is made of metal. They're often found in tombs or burials, in some cases along with a bottle of oil. Yeah, I want to show you a picture of this. I mean, it's not important, but if you use a Turkish bath, you probably want to take one of these next time to protect yourself. See if I can show you real quick, if anybody's left here. Look at this mean thing. It's sharp too. Well, the Essene carried his little shovel, and the Romans carried their little strigils. And from another book I read, this happened to be in, they sharpened this thing up, and they shaved themselves with it. Imagine that. Or you got a pretty little slave girl of about 6 years old to do it for you. Now we speak of Paul. Paul was, especially after Galatians in the 40s, the archenemy of the Nazarenes. I'm sorry to say that. He was the archenemy of the apostles. There's plenty of proof of this in the New Testament. If you read it right, if you read it with that discerning, if you love Paul and you love your Christian faith, you're not going to see those things. It's going to be a deception to you. And especially in some of the Apocrypha, we're told about this and some of the problems they had. So, in fact, in the Clementine homilies, most scholars now that study the homilies think that the real Simon Magus was Paul. And they've got him at the beginning chasing Nazarenes to Damascus. And then later on, Simon Magus shows up, who they want you to equate one with the other. And Simon Magus is in consultation with Peter throughout, fighting him on stage. And Simon Magus has all kinds of things to say. He's a wizard, a witch. And when you read what he has to say, it is so derogatory of Elohim, of the master, of Pita himself. But it's obvious that whoever put that part in is you wanting to see who he calls the enemy, that is Paul, the guy chasing him to Damascus, is actually Simon, the one that's always playing tricks, doing black magic, and flying. All right, we go to sacrifices again. The Essenes probably instituted from Deuteronomy or from the Temple Scroll lip sacrifices. That's all they did. And they could do that because they were the authentic priesthood. So it was sacrifices from the lip, praises with angels, not praising of angels. Of course, they didn't eat meat from the temple. I do believe the Nazarenes ate meat, but in their common lives, people at that time did not eat much meat, very little. If they raised goats or sheep, they didn't eat those sheep. The Roman tax was 50+%. They had to sell those things and give it to the Romans. What did they eat? They did eat a lot of minnows. You heard me. Minnows, because they could take minnows and preserve them. And they did. They pickled minnows, and that was one of the main things they ate. And like Pita says, he ate olives, some grains, but no meats. Yet there's never any talk about vegetarianism in there. It's a matter of lack, or it's a matter of not believing in the temple structure that I believe these guys didn't eat meat. Women could be not only disciples, but apostles. We've got in that cache of gospels called the Nag Hammadi Library. And in several of those gospels, the women are there with the disciples, become apostles, go off on their own teaching ministry. And there are some gospels there that are named after women, like the Gospel of Mary. It's a very good text. Some of those texts from Nag Hammadi are pretty far off, but not all of them. There are several that are good. I believe the Gospel of Thomas is very good. The Gospel of Philip is good, and the Gospel of Mary, of course. And more people of our persuasions are reading those. And I got a call from somebody just the other day who wanted an opinion of what they called the Gnostic Gospels. But really, they're not Gnostic. A couple of them are. I call them their true name, Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi is a little ruin in Egypt, down on the Nile River. They found these papers that in another group called Oxyrhynchus codexes, stuffed into dried crocodiles. 1,000 dried crocodiles in a burial cave, big cave. And they began to want to clean that out at the beginning of the 20th century. And all those crocodiles, they brought them out. They were stuffed with old paper, papyrus, texts. And that's where they found the remnants of a lot of these Nag Hammadi Gospels. Oxyrhynchus, Nag Hammadi. Women Apostles, okay, we got a book called Acts of Philip. I love that book. It tells us what the women did in Nicopolis with Philip. They had an evangelism in this city. It was called Ophisopolis. Ophis in Greek means snakes. They worship snakes in this place. I won't go on much about that, but there was a team sent over by James, Bartholomew, Philip, John, Mary Magdalene, some other women. And they were able to banish the snake worship there through a miracle, a pretty cool miracle. However, Philip, Bartholomew, those two lost their lives there in very bloody ways. And Philip's grave has been found there. Philip's monuments have been found in Nicopolis. take a look. They're quite something else. Not only that, but they found a bread coin, a coin that allows a person to pick up a loaf of bread right there among the tomb, within the Philip's tomb, where they could date that. It was very early. They taught clean and unclean, according to the Torah. They taught healing, visitation, restoration, just as we do. They believed in communal sharing, at least to some extent. And of course, we see that in Acts chapter 2 at the end. And memorial meals, I doubt that they called them a Eucharist. Communion is a word that comes from Aramaic. So, little girl, I say, arise. Talita kumi. Kumi means come together. And that's where the Europeans, Greeks and Latins, got the word communion from Aramaic. Wow. Talita kumi. They also had agape meals. In the evening, the sundown of the Sabbath, they considered that night part of the next day. And they began to have, after the Sabbath, an informal service and a carry-in dinner. Only they called them agape meals, love festivals, where it was not a time for formal worship. It was a time for fellowship, for true communion. And sometimes, like we saw them having one in one of the letters of Paul, or it was in Acts, that Eutychus was up there in the balcony and fell out. Well, that's exactly what they're doing. Paul got on another rant at night, and off he fell. Vegetarianism appears to be a virtue, not a requirement. It's hard for me to understand when meat, cattle, lambs, and there's so much eating in the Jewish literature, including especially the Old Testament and New, that people did not eat meat. There's prohibitions against being vegetarians. Well, people point out Daniel, and they point out something about Adam's diet, and they point out that part about Peter eating olives, but that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody in the world, especially now. So Dan Hill, he's an evangelist. He's on Facebook. This is what I learned from him. He put up an essay. We had a hard time a few years ago because these people that claim to be vegetarians and claim to be Hebrew roots, they came against all of us. They denigrated our names, all in our group. They were all in the group. They became vegetarians. And then they began to call the rest of us murderers. And then we had the think tank was crashed by one of the people. The administrative assistant for the think tank went rogue on this, and she had some way of getting into the members, and she started turning off members one after the other. She got down to 120 members before I came to the recognition of what was going on there. 120, she got out, quit herself. Murderers, bloody people. And when that was happening, let's see, what was I going to even talk about? It was like an all-out war. That's when Dan Hill came out with an essay on this subject. And it is good. I don't think I've ever shared it before, but probably will want to pretty soon. And so I think that it was considered a virtue. I think it gets you one more orbit closer to the sun of perfection. I did it for 6 months. I didn't see what was so hard about that. But I can't see it as the norm, especially for Nazarene Judaism. When those people were poor, if the poor people didn't eat meat, not because they didn't believe in that, except temple meat, they didn't eat meat because they couldn't afford it. Peter did not eat fish. He had to sell those fish to pay the tax, except the small minnows. He keeps the minnows, pickles them, or boils them, and the family eats those anytime, but not the big, lush fishes. It was open to Gentiles, the Nazarenes. We see Clement coming in. He's about as Gentile as you can get, and he's a relative of two emperors, close relative. Mixed multitude, abortion forbidden strictly. It's considered murder. They recognized in practice vows, primarily religious vows, thinking about the Nazarite vow. They could do that. Some did vows of poverty and several other vows, but I don't think they did that in secular world. I can find vows of religious kinds, but I can't see the secular one. They strictly kept the food ordinances, I believe. By the way, why does Yahshua, why does he cook up some fish for them after the resurrection if he doesn't eat fish? I have a theory about that. I believe that of the fish they ate, it says that somebody got a fish and tore it open with their hands. Probably pretty used to doing that because they just catch them and eat them. They were used on a net, not a hook. And so I read somewhere, I'm not sure where, but that they didn't consider whitefish, especially small ones, to be meat. Why? It said that because when they broke them open, they didn't bleed. There's no blood coming out. And I got to say, having done some fishing in my life, you take that fishing knife and you cut into the flesh of a fish, unless it's a big fish, and you won't see any blood. You might see some parasites, but no blood. So what I was reading, I can't tell you what anymore. It's a long time ago. They might have not have even considered fish to be meat. And that's the way you can argue vegetarianism both ways. Well, why did he eat fish? Because fish wasn't considered to be meat. Okay. And they had some pretty different death and burial practices as well, which I won't go into. I've gone long enough tonight. I probably can do one more night of this. I know that I'm stumbling around and stuttering, but it's going to get worse as time goes on. So I really appreciate you coming here. It means a lot to me. I don't know if there's a question or not. Can't really. Nope. Just one chat. I think that's a hello. It is a hello. Hey, Yahweh bless you. I'll see you next Tuesday. And if you do Halloween, if you do Thanksgiving, go ahead and enjoy yourself. That's a good day. Amen.